Hello and welcome as always to APAC Games Weekly. This is episode 56. I am your host, Connell Suter, and in typical fashion, we'll be taking a look through the biggest games headlines of the past week from across East Asia. Today, we've got a variety of stories, but only from two countries. We'll be kicking off with Star Wars Outlaws being rated in South Korea, a new Xbox dev kit being certified in South Korea, and ending on a thought-provoking story about the term gamer and how Asian gamers identify with it. It's going to be interesting. But let's jump right in with the more interesting than the headline suggests, Star Wars Outlaws. Star Wars Outlaws has been rated 19 plus in South Korea. You've likely heard of Star Wars Outlaws already, as it's the major open-world Star Wars RPG that everyone has always wanted, or at least let's hope it is. It's being developed by Ubisoft, and it appears the game has been rated adults only, aka 19 plus, in South Korea. As you'd imagine, adult-only ratings are never something companies are really happy to receive. Many countries, I believe still including the US, actually don't allow adult-only games to be sold in certain marketplaces and alongside other titles, often restricting their sale on major platforms. This was a huge issue back with Manhunt 2, way back in the day, probably showing my age a little bit. In that case, the game initially received an AO rating in the US, and a lot was done to try bring that down to allow it to be sold in regular stores. Manhunt 2 was obviously AO rated due to its horrendous, unrelenting violence, but as you'd imagine, that isn't the issue here, thankfully. The GRAC's AO rating is used when a game includes, quote, representations of anti-societal idea, religion and public morals that would be harmful to children under 19 emotionally and physically, end quote. Very interesting to note in that description that they say children under 19. You know, in most of the world, an 18-year-old is not regarded as a child anymore. It's an interesting bit of linguistic strangeness. But you're probably thinking from that, wow, this sounds really serious, what have they done? But in this case, Outlaws has received the 19 plus rating for gambling. The GRAC's guide states that a 19 plus rating for gambling should be used when, quote, reproduction of gambling spirit, existence of arousing of passion of excessive use of gaming money, or dependence on one's luck, but no real gaining or loss of one's asset, unquote. Quite a strange and wordy description. So you can see actually on the Korean rating website that this is the only AO related issue with the game. They show it with highlighted icons. This is the only one highlighted. Eurogamer, who covered the situation, translated the additional description, which in English states, quote, realistic depictions of speculative behavior, presence of a minigame which contains in-game betting and payouts, unquote. It's worth noting that the rating doesn't mention any real-world gambling mechanics, which could be things like loot boxes, but this is yet to be confirmed as 100%, although it seems likely the game wouldn't have that in it. It's also really important to remember that in South Korea, gambling is very tightly controlled and effectively illegal, which has led to this rating being so serious. As an old Knights of the Old Republic player, it was actually just this week I was thinking about how much I enjoyed PAZAK and the games that had these fun little card games in them. It was effectively a sort of Star Wars-ified blackjack, and it was in, I believe, KOTOR 2 as well. It was a lot of fun. I really enjoy that kind of thing in games, so it's really a shame to think that this new game is having issues from something that's really quite minor like that. I mean, we don't know, maybe it is a wider aspect of the game, but it probably isn't. It's probably a small feature. So, to us, in other markets, that rating feels like a big overreaction, but it is an issue that games can face in countries with extremely strict gambling controls. back in the day, I don't think it's the case anymore, hopefully, but I say, but back in the day, Australia used to ban games outright for having graffiti in them. It's a pretty crazy thing. There was a fascinating situation with a game called Mark Echo's Getting Up, which was a game about being a graffiti artist that was never released in Australia. I believe it still isn't, and probably is still technically illegal. It's a crazy one. With this situation though, it is just probably a mini game within the game, as the description did mention. So if it isn't core to any part of the game, like main story or progress generally, it is possible Ubisoft could remove it from a Korean release, but that would take a lot of work. Korean gamers must be pretty upset at the moment with the amount of games that are maybe not being released there, but it's a really interesting situation and one that we'll keep an eye on to see how it develops. A new Xbox dev kit has reportedly been certified in South Korea. So it appears that a rather canny Twitter user called Xbox News for Koreans, nice and catchy name, noticed a new dev kit for the Xbox had been approved for use by South Korea's National Radio Research Agency. You might think, as I did, why is a radio agency rating a games development kit? In South Korea, new devices must be approved by this radio research agency to ensure they aren't harmful to the radio wave environment that they maintain. Quite interesting. So supposedly, from the details that this Twitter user has found and shared, the kit was built in China and Vietnam and has the model number 2089, which differs from the Xbox Series X dev kit, which had the model number 1881. This is what's making people think it must be something new, or at least something different. Some are suggesting that this could be a sometimes mentioned all-digital Xbox Series X, which is codenamed Brooklyn. It was mentioned in some of those leaked documents that came out last year, I think relating to the acquisition of Activision. So this, to me, does sound a little unlikely. This is because, from what I know, the all-digital PS5s have sold far fewer units than their standard consoles that include a disc drive. It's pretty easy to understand why, and it does make you wonder if Xbox would continue down this road, especially considering the lower sales they've experienced with this series, as well as consoles generally this generation doing far worse than they hoped for, with many gamers moving to PC or having moved to PC years ago. I mean, you can see it with Sony's investment with PC games in a way they've never done before, Microsoft releasing games on PlayStation, although you do wonder how much of that is to appease the regulators due to the Activision acquisition, but it is an interesting one to think about. That leaked document, by the way, mentioned that console at the time had a target release date of November 2024. Obviously, how true that is now is to be seen. It's also possible it's a completely different hardware SKU, but who is really to say? It's a very interesting development, and one you don't hear happening that much, a new dev kit floating around for a console that we've never heard of and have no idea about. So yeah, watch this space, could be something interesting. And for our final story of this episode, Thai gamers don't identify with the gamer label. So this is an issue that's weirdly close to my heart. I've cared about it for quite a few years for various reasons. My personal choice of games coverage came from Jeff Gerstmann and GameSpot and then Giant Bomb back in the day, and he and the wider crew always talked about how the term gamer was developed by marketers to better target those who play games. As you'd imagine from that, it really doesn't have much meaning outside of a very basic label of this person has at some point played a video game. Unfortunately, since then, and with the growth of the industry, the term gamer has been kind of cemented as the go-to lingo for talking about games enthusiasts. The problem is that it's such a general term, it fails to capture all nuance within the games community, effectively alienating everyone involved. And that is how it's affecting Thai gamers. The issue has been fascinatingly highlighted by a study from Omnicom Media Group Asia Pacific, who surveyed groups from various APAC countries about how they identify with the term gamer. So it's an interesting study, and you can see from across APAC, you get very different results. You've got countries like China and Vietnam hitting 85% of those surveyed identifying as gamers or being sort of happy to have that label applied to them. This is also worth remembering as general population. They've not targeted people who specifically play games, but it actually does say much more because of that about the wider population and how people feel about it. From those highs of 85%, you can drop down to 60% for Australia and New Zealand. Anyone who listened to last week's episode will remember my quick rant about Australia and New Zealand as part of APAC, but anyway. But yeah, it's interesting. So those countries have far less. Now, from what we know, that kind of makes sense. China and Vietnam do have a bigger gaming population than Australia and New Zealand, and it makes sense that these numbers reflect that. Now, what's interesting is to focus on two countries in the heart of APAC. The lowest gaming identifying populaces across all of the Asia-Pacific region are Thailand and South Korea. Now, immediately you're probably thinking, really, South Korea? But yeah, South Korea, the lowest on the list. We'll talk a little bit more about that in a second. But first to Thailand. Thailand's demographic has only 40% of those surveyed considering themselves gamers. And it's a perfect example of the issue with the term. So Thailand obviously has actually way more than 40% of people playing games, even just casually, but these experiences are primarily on smartphones, tablets, and other sort of multi-purpose tech. This is where some of the nuance begins. If you play a couple of word or number-based games a week, you probably don't consider gaming as a major aspect of your life or something you identify with. Certainly, from the results when they asked people why they didn't identify with it, a lot of what they said was they only play it occasionally, they only play a couple of games, or they just don't play enough in a slightly amorphous way to identify themselves with that term. That of course makes sense if you're thinking about people who buy purpose-bought hardware and play games constantly, regularly. They're invested in the industry of it, the art of it. So you can see why those people wouldn't feel that they should be grouped alongside those other people. You know, they enjoy a different thing to what this group enjoys. And I think an interesting comparison here that is fairly accurate in terms of a lot of the same considerations that the term gamer has is, imagine someone watching a movie once a week. You probably wouldn't call yourself a film buff compared with someone who maybe loves the art of film or watches them constantly, is always on top of, interesting movies, watching independent cinema. Most of us wouldn't think of ourselves as being in the same category as that person. I can certainly say, I enjoy film, but I don't study it in the way that I know some people who do and who really love it, and I wouldn't put myself in the same category as them. I certainly had this exact discussion actually with my mum many years ago, telling her that she would be considered a gamer because she plays Words with Friends and a Scrabble game on her phone. And she just was actually offended by being called a gamer more than anything. She was like, "Don't call me a gamer, how dare you?" So it's not just a unique issue to Asia Pacific, but it's a good encapsulation of the issue. One problem as well with this debate is that there is a lot of social considerations to think about when you're discussing this term, particularly because of the history of the games industry and quote-unquote gamers attempting to kind of other groups based on gender, sexuality as not real gamers, which unfortunately confuses and sours debates on the subject. I think we can all think of examples of gaming groups online saying things like women aren't gamers or other stupid things like that. And that is all what kind of feeds into this situation. So to talk a little bit more about South Korea, now it's crazy. As I said, South Korea has the lowest response of gaming identifying people in the entire survey. Only 37% of those surveyed considered themselves gamers, which is far lower than the number of actual people who play games in South Korea. Again, a really interesting description, and probably something to do with the fact that because South Korea has such a history in the games industry of gaming and of games being a more predominant aspect of culture than a lot of countries, of course, with things like StarCraft always being huge and attracting big crowds. that people kind of understand the context maybe a bit more. And then, if they play a couple games on their phones, but everyone they know is playing, League of Legends every day, they probably wouldn't consider themselves gamers in that same way. It's a very interesting example of it, actually. Overall, this study does really highlight that marketers need to do a better job when it comes to understanding the nuances in gaming communities, and, in my opinion, probably should move away from this archaic, out-of-touch terminology, which at this point serves very little, if any, purpose. And that was it for APAC Games Weekly, episode 56. Thank you so much for sticking with me through this bumper episode that's somehow longer than usual despite only having 3 stories. I guess I'm in a bit of a rambly mood this afternoon. I hope you found these stories interesting though, and it gives you some food for thought, especially on the term gamer, and also if Star Wars Outlaws will actually release in South Korea. I hope it does. I feel really bad for Korean gamers at the moment. They're facing a lot of games not coming out, But anyway, we'll be back next week, same time, same place. Monday, 12 PM GMT, YouTube and Spotify, you know where to find us. I hope to see you then. Until then, have a fantastic week.